depending on where you may be. Thank you again for standing by, and welcome to today's Global Rational User Community webcast. Our topic for today is SAFe at Any Speed, the importance of DevOps in a scaled Agile organization. All phone lines are currently in a listen-only mode, and later there will be a question and answer session with instructions being given at that time. You may ask a question at any time using the chat window located in the control panel. Chat questions will be answered at the end of the presentation with the rest of the Q&A portion. Today's session is being recorded, and you'll be provided a copy of today's materials following the call. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker for today. Dan Gillio has nearly 25 years of experience specializing in enabling software development organizations to achieve a new level of success in a variety of highly competitive industries. As an experienced software lifecycle consultant, Dan helps customers architect and implement a consistent strategy across their enterprise, incorporating requirements, deployment, and testing tools. Dan holds numerous IBM Rational certifications and has participated for many years with the Rational Voice of the Client's events, working closely with IBM product management to enhance products and establish the strategic vision of their offerings. Dan, take it away.
Thank you, Sam. So let me just go over the agenda for the presentation. We're going to cover basically three specific areas just to give you some overall basics around SAFe, and specifically the areas that and precepts that really apply to DevOps and really require you to have that kind of DevOps presence. The second is the typical challenges that we see as an organization that specializes in doing these SAFe transformation, and some of the insight that we can provide in those different scenarios that we see. And then finally, we'll talk about how to build your internal deployment pipeline and utilizing the different technologies that are available, but also what are you trying to achieve? What is the goal, and what is the ultimate enablement you're looking to do for your SAFe team? So we'll go ahead and start with a quick poll just to get a baseline of where individuals attending are today. So Sam, if you can go ahead and put up the poll question.
Absolutely. The poll is live, ladies and gentlemen. Excuse me. And the question is, what is your experience with the Scaled Agile framework? We have several answers. My organization is adopting and has adopted SAFe, in the process of evaluating SAFe as an option, just beginning to use Scrum or another Agile approach, already using Scrum or another Agile approach, or the only SAFe you care about is the one you store your valuables in. Got a good amount of the audience voting. We'll leave it open for another 5-10 seconds to make sure everyone gets a chance to make a vote. All right. So it looks like we're standing, Dan, about 29% is or has adopted SAFe. Excuse me. 18% are in the process of evaluating SAFe. 11% just beginning to use Scrum or another Agile approach. 37%, the bulk of the audience, already uses Scrum or another Agile approach. And 5% are concerned about what SAFe they store their valuables in.
Okay, great. So let's jump into just some basics, like I mentioned, in terms of SAFe. So we'll start with the SAFe big picture. Now, this is basically just end-to-end, the details in terms of implementing SAFe boiled down into this sort of graphical representation. You can see the three main areas that it pulls out are portfolio, program, and team. And you have the different individuals and disciplines and all of the basic structure that you have around the Scaled Agile framework. But in terms of DevOps, what we really want to do is focus in on three specific areas that when you look at them within the context of SAFe, really make the need for having a robust DevOps organization critical for the success of the adoption. So value streams, the Agile Release Train, and your program increment objectives, those three areas we'll dig into a little bit deeper and try to give you the understanding of why those areas are very dependent on your DevOps infrastructure and organization being in place. So if we start with the value stream, think of the value stream as kind of the heart of the lean thinking that SAFe embraces. It basically recommends looking at the flow of work from when an idea is developed and then to when it's consumed by the customer. And guiding principle there is time to market. So the important detail for the DevOps perspective is that time to market is quickened by taking a view that the best way to shorten the release cycle while achieving high quality, productivity, and low cost is to remove the delays in the process, not to shortcut the steps themselves. So it's all about efficiency, and value streams themselves need to fall into these areas you see there: compelling, kind of long-term initiatives, and things that differentiate you from your competitors, or when you're getting into the specifics of them. But from a DevOps perspective, again, it's about that value to market and increasing that time, the availability of that to your teams. The Agile Release Train. So basically, this is the kind of virtual organization within SAFe, generally between 5 and 12 teams, between 15 and 125 individuals, and these are the teams that plan and commit and execute these items together. So again, from a DevOps perspective, we want this to be the high-speed Agile train. We want to be able to move things through efficiently and produce these evaluatable items within a 2-week span. This is something that's incremented across the teams and provides these milestones that need to be enforced. The other concepts are the shippable increments versus the actual every 2-week increments. So what we want to try and do is provide a potentially shippable increment every 2 weeks. But again, recognizing many organizations may not actually release to production, they may go more of an 8 to 12 week type cadence where they actually release it into production. But the key is the things that you're reviewing and evaluating within those 2-week periods are done. They're something which could be shipped if you chose to. So again, from a DevOps perspective, we need to make sure that we can do the testing, build, deployment, all of the activities that are required and streamline that process. And finally, the program increment, it provides the structure to connect the long-term vision for the teams, and it's kind of similar to what a sprint is to a team today. So you're looking at getting feedback, improving the process, and you see from the graphic we have here, it's this concept of building and incrementing it over time, and that you're demonstrating it to the organization. You're seeing this over time, and you're building towards that end vision, but you're seeing that incremental progress. And again, the ability to have your infrastructure in place to support this is something that ends up being required, and oftentimes is an afterthought, and we'll get into that a little bit. So typical challenges that we observe when we're doing these SAFe transformations. So teams will begin their SAFe journey with really high expectations. So Scaled Agile Academy offers a range of courses in scope, and you see some of them listed there, ranging from 4 days down to 1 day. And you'll have teams go off to do this training and learn about Scaled Agile framework and within the context of their role, and come back ready to speed ahead in Agile practices here. So to illustrate this, I have some prominent race car drivers here. This is what the people in the metaphor that we use. So you have Mario Andretti on the left, Michael Schumacher, who's the winningest Formula One, and for the NASCAR aficionados, Richard Petty. This is where you're ready to go high speed. And then what you have waiting back for you in your DevOps garage is this. So putting the best car driver in the world in this with the maximum speed of 71 miles per hour, it's going to be a disappointment. And this is what we can see with organizations that are just looking at the process side of scaled Agile and not the underlying structure. So what does that look like in some specific examples that we see? So the first one, in terms of building a better mousetrap. So any of you seen this game that came out in the 60s, was popular in the 70s, is based on the idea of building this kind of complex contraption that's deliberately over-engineered to perform the simple task of catching a mouse. When we come in to organizations, is an organization like Blue Agility, and we'll see organizations that have something similar to this setup. They're using tools from multiple vendors. These tools don't have any sort of meaningful traceability through them, and most of their processes are very manual. People kicking off manual builds, the concept of the run book. So I have a 20-page document that I produce that gets done, and it's very manual and error-prone processes. And this is not going to work in terms of getting to those 2-week deliverable increments and sprints in general. So what are the most common impediments to change in these examples? Well, the first one, kind of illustrated by the graphic here, is that developers tend to always believe however they're doing their work today is the best way to do it. So any type of change that get introduced into the organization, developers tend to push back, whether it's changing from their source code management tool to their build process, whether it's the process that they use to move the code through. Developers tend to be very rigid in a lot of cases in terms of the way they've done things. The second item is that there may not be the budget available to absorb the cost to do this retrofit. So when you start getting into it, a lot of the times there is a cost both in a training, retooling, or just the time to actually do those automations, which we'll talk about a little bit later. That's not been accounted for. And then there's the standby of, well, we've always done it this way. So overcoming that kind of cultural barrier with teams to say, okay, well, we're changing the way that you're actually working at a program and portfolio level with the Scaled Agile framework. There needs to be that companion change from a DevOps perspective. The second example is kind of this idea in the play on the tortoise and the hare concept of, in this case, slow and steady loses the race. So these are organizations that we'll start working with that are very risk averse. So not only are they not agile, they actively throttle agility by using their internal tried and true processes that they believe that they have in terms of just checks and balances that, again, culturally, they're very hesitant to remove. So this is the idea of that I just need a new test bed to validate my web app, and I have to go through a 90-day review period and get director-level sign-off to just get a VM test instance. And organizations just dealing with that culturally. The other piece that's often key is this disconnect between development, operations, and business needs. So you have these siloed organizations, and the developers say, look, I just do what I do, and when I'm done, I throw it over the wall, and then operations figures out actually how to deploy it and to manage the environment. And then nobody's really taking into account the business need, where the stakeholder is saying, look, I've been waiting 6 months or 9 months for this feature to show up in the actual product. Isn't there a way that we can streamline that process and move that more quickly? So what are the common impediments to change in this? Well, one is the perception that the technology is not compatible with agility that these organizations are using. So again, illustrated by the nice circa 1950s IBM mainframe, that they just will throw up these barriers to say that, yeah, that may work if you're working for a small startup and you're developing a mobile app, but we're a much larger organization than that, and we use these very complex technologies, and you just can't move quickly when you're dealing with those. Some of it is the belief that regulation prohibits this. So because we're governed by Sarbanes-Oxley, or the data that we use is HIPAA protected, or whatever the regulation is within an organization, that there's the belief that, again, we need to impede agility because of the risk posed by violating any of these regulations. The last one is the kind of large bureaucracies that don't have an incentive to change within their organization. So this is the threat that these changes in the DevOps practice may have to say, well, if I'm the person that sits and comes in Friday night at 11 p.m. and goes through that 20-page run book that I mentioned and moves these things out into production, well, if you automate that so it's one button click, or not even one button click, it's just time to go in. So when 11 p.m. hits, the deployment is automated and it goes in. Well, is that a threat to my job security? And is my manager looking at it as a threat to the kind of kingdom he's built within the organization of these individuals that manage things on the operations side? So these are some of the impediments that those organizations in that profile have. The last example we're saying is kind of the Agile Release Train going off the rails. This is the idea of the disconnect between maybe the development organization and leadership buying into the concepts of the scaled Agile framework, but not really including DevOps, and that's more of just kind of an afterthought once they get into it. So the concept of running projects and managing them at that portfolio and program down to the team level, and those may be attractive to the organization. But then you have the teams that are maybe either using waterfall or very kind of compartmentalized, even Scrum processes, being asked to convert these to work in an Agile way and being constrained by these very tight schedules that maybe we did one release every 3 months, and maybe we went through that process in a very kind of methodical sort of way. Now we're trying to push that down to 2 weeks to get everything that we've done in that time. So what are the impediments to change that these profile organizations to see? Well, again, we're back to, if DevOps is an afterthought, did they plan for the cost of the transformation? Not, again, just from the technology standpoint, but from the resources required to make that change. There may be no clear map of how to streamline things. So if this was an afterthought, we don't even know where to start in terms of what the most efficiencies we can gain are within the organization. And then finally, we're back to kind of that organizational structure. So if we have this disconnect between the development organization, the program management, and the operations team that ultimately moves these things in, well, there may not be buy-in. And having the collaboration required for those teams, just because we've decided to move to scaled Agile framework and move to that from a development and testing and program and product management organization, doesn't mean if I'm managing the operations team that I've bought into that. So how do we move to the idea of building the pipeline in terms of your organization? How do we tackle these issues? Well, within Blue Agility, what we try to do is the concept of utilizing the principles within the scaled Agile framework to guide your DevOps transformation. Well, what does that mean? That SAFe tells us that people and the management and the functional departments constitute a system that builds the system. So that's where we apply this system thinking, that your value needs to cross organizational boundaries to accelerate the value that you require to eliminate these functional silos. You also have to have the leaders understand that they need to take a long-term view, that decisions that they're making today will impact these future outcomes. So investing in DevOps today will provide the foundation for that future value delivery. And we'll get into that a little bit later in terms of what that looks like within the organization and how to build that momentum and the need to do that. Some of the other principles that you see here are, again, to build incrementally. That's for your DevOps organization, the same way that we would be preaching that for your actual applications that you're building. Create these milestones and do them in an objective way in terms of what the best milestones are to base them on the working systems you're trying to do. And then limit your work in progress. That if you're doing a lot of things and just nibbling at the edges of it, it's going to be problematic. Limit the work in progress and focus it on the highest value items. And that goes back actually to the earlier concept we were talking with the value stream mapping. Doing the same thing for your DevOps transformation. What are the areas that we can hit relatively quickly that will help with that transformation and make an impact in a meaningful way? So just to contrast and show you one example, from the IBM perspective, what their lifecycle view is. So if you look at that kind of circle within the circles graphic there, they're talking about kind of these four concepts of that you steer, develop, /test, deploy, and operate. And you sort of loop through that cycle. And then they list kind of the specific type of DevOps practices kind of around the periphery of that. So collaborative development, continuous release and deployment, monitoring, all of these areas. So this is kind of the IBM vision of the tooling that they provide and the concept that they have in terms of these areas. And again, things like automation of manual activities, trying to do that as much as you can, not just from a efficiency standpoint, from it taking less time, but from an efficiency standpoint that you're now removing the opportunity for there to be the risk that manual processes have. That, again, back to that run book we mentioned earlier, well, maybe I misread or I miss a step because it's 1 in the morning on Friday evening going to Saturday when I'm actually doing this because that's our system outage window, and I'm kind of blurry-eyed and I miss a step. Automating that not only will provide the benefit from a scaled Agile perspective, but also increase the quality, which is what we're looking to do. And then the other piece about just measuring and monitoring the progress of it. So how does that align to what SAFe has to say about DevOps? Well, within the Scaled Agile framework, they call out specific areas that require you to really look at when you're developing your pipeline to support SAFe. So there's these 6 kind of principles that we'll go into and discuss in terms of the best way to approach these. So we'll start with looking, though, at what SAFe says in terms of how these sort of work through in terms of the representation. So the concept of everything being in version control, you see in the graphic there to the left, they're talking about everything. Your tests, test data, not just code. So people will think version control maybe means code, maybe means configuration files, but doesn't really mean these other areas. When we're talking about version control, we're talking about everything required to kind of build your system. That segues into the idea of automating your deployment system. That then says that we need to maintain a staging environment that's kind of equivalent to production. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, what that actually means. And then ultimately deploying the configuration to production to do that in a way that provides this consistency. So SAFe recommends this kind of view in terms of just how to approach the DevOps practice. So again, back to the key kind of concepts here of putting everything under version control. Again, they're just talking about, and I can't kind of stress this enough, everything. Not just code that you're checking in to do your actual development. And kind of what do we see kind of from within the field teams doing? Now, there's obviously different approaches, different technology approaches. One of the ones that we see is utilizing Rational Team Concert to do this. Now, one of the benefits something like Rational Team Concert has is that you can not only marry the version control aspect, but with your change management. So Blue Agility developed a SAFe template for Rational Team Concert dating back to version 4, so going back a number of years. IBM just introduced with their latest 6.0 version a template that they provide that covers it. But the idea is that not only can you marry the place where you store your source code and build and all the other pieces that Rational Team Concert handles, but you can align that to the concepts of SAFe around your epics, your features, your stories, and the tasks. So it's putting that concept of why I was in there kind of mucking around and making changes to these files, the task that's associated with the story that's associated to the feature that rolls up to the epic. So we get that view in terms of the value we're providing sprint over these program increments that we're working through, and Team Concert enables that. It also provides, obviously, the metrics then that you can rely on for running your SAFe team to know how you're doing in terms of your planning, and as you evolve and mature your teams, you can utilize a tool like Team Concert to do that. So kind of two other concepts that we're kind of combining here is things related to the environment. So first, the concept of this kind of production equivalent staging. That most organizations typically, obviously, have a different environment in production, basically because of the economics of it and of both maintaining it, both from a cost and a maintenance level. So that you may have 20 servers managing your farm in production. Well, we're probably not going to replicate that in staging. We may use 2 servers instead. So how can we do that, though, to maintain equivalency? There's things where you can at least try to simulate what you think the areas are that can be kind of the gotchas when you're moving your items into production. And this will rely on your subject matter experts to provide you with that insight. So maybe you get a load balancer from the same vendor that has your production one, but you get a cheaper one, and so that the technology is basically the same, but it doesn't need to be robust, obviously, because it's not managing production. Maintaining your development and test environments to match production is another area that they talk about. So this is not only propagating all of the changes that you have, but making sure that these test environments are set up in a way that allows you to not only validate the application you're writing, but to validate the way that it implements it from even a performance management standpoint. So one of the things that we find in the field is things like, in this case, InfoSphere for doing data privacy and data masking. This is a big challenge we see in organizations where they'll say the scenario is we've implemented this application in production. It's a long-lived application. We make changes of it periodically over time, but say that we are regulated, we're a financial institution, and we're regulated by Sarbanes-Oxley, and we're very concerned about data privacy as well. So how do we manage to get data into a staging environment so that if we want to run performance tests, that we're getting something that's equivalent? Well, there's these type of solutions that organizations can look at, and again, they may need to invest in if it's something they haven't seen. But to get that true level of performance validation where you're doing that data masking so that I can still test against the same number of records in production, but I deal with the organizational concerns about the risk of it actually being identical data that's in production. So these type of solutions allow you to manage that risk and deal with that in a way that you, again, supports your need for agility and your need to know that what you're demonstrating when we're doing those 2-week demos in that staging environment, that the teams can be sure that, okay, if it takes 10 seconds to return data when I run a query, that's virtually what they will see in production because we're using a comparable set of data to do those demonstrations that are, again, kind of critical and part of the scaled Agile, or even the Scrum concept as well. The ability to automatically build environments. This is a big one for organizations where we'll start working with them and talking about the concept of, in the world today, of virtualization of environments. Whether it's in the cloud, whether it's a private cloud, or they're doing public space. The concept of any time that you're spending troubleshooting a test bed environment is time that you're wasting from a configuration standpoint. Because you're looking and saying, I've had this test bed lying around for 6 months. I've had people going in, changing configuration files, changing versions of files. Has a fix pack been released to do this? Is it the same as what's in production? These very manual process increase the time to manage them. And again, if we embrace the concept of virtualization, we can address that. And then making this environment process as automated as you can will, again, remove that barrier of, well, within a 2-week span, I can't just tear down my test environment, set it up, deploy the latest build, because that's a 6-week process. Automating that and getting buy-in from leadership to do that will pay the dividends of then streamlining that process and having this reliable process. It also gives you the ability to kind of vet your deployment process, because if you can't get it right deploying it to your test bed, how are we going to get it right when we go to staging, let alone to production? So what do we see in the field for this type of thing? Well, again, from an IBM perspective, UrbanCode is something that we see teams using to do this provisioning. And because UrbanCode is basically agnostic on what you're doing, you can deploy in any type of these types of environments. And you see the list there in terms of whether it's Amazon or VM or Docker. Docker being a very popular one that we're seeing where organizations want to use that for their environment. Well, something like UrbanCode allowing you to organize that in a repeatable way that you can move this information through. So then finally, this goal of deployment automation. So we are very cognizant of telling teams to think of this as kind of the start, and I think SAFe even talks about it that way. They don't really give you a very declarative statement to say you must automate the actual deployment process. That they talk about starting the idea of automating that process, especially into your production environment. This is one of the pain points that operation teams seem to see in terms of the focus on these areas to start. At least start focusing on how you build your code, do those test environments I mentioned, creating them, then automating the execution of the tests, and then the deployment and validation of the code. This is an incremental process that we know takes time within organizations and really requires a commitment from your organization because, again, it's going to be disruptive from the standpoint of taking these very manual processes and automating them. And during that process, you're going to want to examine them. You're not just going to want to say, we're going to automate everything. You're also going to want to take the step back to say, how does this process add value? And if we're back to that earlier slide of, well, this is the way we've always done it, that isn't necessarily the right answer to that question. We need to look at what the value is that it provides to the organization. So this aligns to the idea of, again, deploying to staging every sprint and then deploying to production frequently. So this is the concept that we mentioned earlier that SAFe embraces of, if you're doing that demo and you have these different teams that are part of your Agile Release Train, they're all contributing different elements to the overall system. Well, we want to make sure that when we have that integration, that these systems function. We don't want to push off the risk to say, well, the last demo I did was just showing you this, but we hadn't integrated the security profile for this application yet because the security team is working on it, but we didn't integrate their code yet. We're going to wait and do that later. Well, you're pushing off the risk, and you're really not demonstrating to the organization and to your stakeholders that are reviewing this during your development the actual functionality of the app. You're pushing off that risk. So by deploying the staging from every sprint and doing those demos from staging, you're going to give the teams as clear a picture as you can of what they should expect to see in production. So this term deployability becomes part of what you're saying when your user stories are done. That if I tell you that the user story is done, and then you ask, okay, well, how are we going to move it into an environment to use? I say, well, I really haven't thought that through yet. Well, then the story's not done. The part of the story not only needs to be the functionality, but how am I going to deliver that functionality to the organization? And then this also deals with the idea of the merging and synchronization that you have within these different instances, and just making sure, again, that you feel a higher degree of comfortability and certainty with what the process is going to be to ultimately get to production. Because the last thing you want to do is demonstrate this to your stakeholders, have them excited about this functionality, and then have to go back and work with the operations team to go, okay, now how do we get this into production? Because we've done this in a very manual way. I don't know if I've documented all the steps. And let's keep our fingers crossed that when we have the cutover to production that this works. And a lot of this obviously is seeing kind of the high-profile organizations where you hear that a airline reservation system was impacted by a cutover and they're rolling back. And those type of organizations try to eliminate that risk. So again, what are we seeing in the field? Well, again, UrbanCode has this solution from an IBM perspective with UDeploy, where it really steps you through building that pipeline. So how do I build that pipeline in terms of not only the development cycle, but ultimately moving all the way through into production, and allowing you to reuse as much of that knowledge that you gain from the development cycle, moving into your integration test environments, and then ultimately into that staging environment, and then leveraging that for production. So we're not reinventing this process. We're trying to maximize the reuse we have of the concepts that it takes to take the application that we're working on, or the solution that we're working on, and move it through the process. So in terms of what we've seen and what the value is within an organization, there's areas that we want to address in terms of just what we've talked about. So what we've really talked about is really starting with those three key SAFe concepts and how they require the DevOps environment to be robust and to deliver those value streams, to work across teams within an Agile Release Train and working at that same cadence. How, if we don't have the DevOps infrastructure in place, that's going to be a challenge for us. And then delivering those program increments over time are going to be a challenge, because we're dealing with just the mechanics of how to actually get the code in, let alone get it aligned, let alone deliver it in a consistent way that the organization is looking for. We talked about some of the organizational challenges that Blue Agility sees, and I'm sure many organizations that do what we do see when we're implementing these transformations based on SAFe. And then talk about these kind of 6 core DevOps principles of SAFe that align to the IBM technologies, and like I said, the other technologies as well, and how these core principles require the teams to examine before you're implementing SAFe, preferably before, how the impact is going to be on your organization, so that we can have that race car waiting for you when you've gotten your training to be a race car and a driver. How can we get as much of that in place, or at least acknowledge that we need to have a roadmap to get there? So what are the recipes that we see for successful organizations that do this? Well, it's no sort of accident that the first item is leadership buy-in. Without getting leadership buy-in from your organization, you're not going to basically be able to move forward with this in the same way the adoption of the scaled Agile framework requires it, because this is the area where it's going to be painful in some cases to move to your DevOps organization and modernize it. And it's probably going to take budget. Whether that budget is just additional people and resources or technology, it's going to take a commitment from leadership. And if they start getting kind of skittish once they start seeing these things and want to push back or kind of fall back to other processes, it's going to pose a problem for your success in terms of your scaled Agile framework, the implementation, and the DevOps journey that you're pushing through. So we try to educate the leadership around kind of this straight story around this concept of the J curve. So if they know going in up front that if we stay at your current state, you'll be there and there's not going to be any disruption and you'll stay kind of at that state. But if what we're looking to do is move to a desired state of better productivity and performance from your DevOps team in this case, there's going to be this area in this period of disruption. And during that period, we're actually going to see the productivity and performance probably go down. And what the idea is that we're looking to say that we want to minimize the depth and length of that curve during that period of disruption. But it's naive in terms of the working within an organization to take on this kind of DevOps transformation without acknowledging this kind of elephant in the room. Well, how am I going to make all these changes and streamline the way that we build and deploy and test and automate and ultimately move these things through with the same number of people, with the same schedule we have for the current releases? Well, you're not. And unless you throw a lot of resources at it and do sort of parallel development of your DevOps with completely different teams, which then undermines a lot of what we've talked about, learning from what the organization does and not just reproducing the different processes they have, but examining them and determining which ones we can throw out, which ones stay, and any new processes that maybe we can adopt that will allow us to streamline the process. The other one is to remain open-minded, and this goes back to that kind of some of the examples we gave earlier, whether it's developers or testers or the operation team, no real protected interest. So if we go back to the example that I mentioned of the person who takes that run book and comes in and manually does those steps, try to get them to remain open-minded and say, okay, instead of you doing those actual steps, we're going to invest in you and train you on whether it's UrbanCode or train you on how to work with Docker. We'll train you in a way where you're relevant within the organization, but you're contributing to a way that streamlines the process. Try to deal with those protected interests in organizations who may feel, is this type of automation and this type of things that we're talking about to streamline your DevOps organization, is that a threat to my livelihood? And change that narrative to say, not only is it not a threat, it's actually going to enhance your skills and enhance your value to the organization, because we're going to invest in you in the ways to help us on this transformation. So we have kind of the representation here of the don't boil the ocean kind of metaphor. Set realistic expectations. The same way that as a SAFe organization from developing an application, we would tell you to set these realistic expectations. Your DevOps organization does. So this is back to the value stream mapping. This is back to determining what will provide you the best benefit for the organization and prioritizing your DevOps transformation in that way. So maybe it's dealing with that testbed scenario that I laid out and saying, okay, we can pretty quickly get a solution based on Amazon Cloud here and do this and get this in place so that we can stop all the mucking around with our old testbed environments and streamline that process. Maybe it's just automated testing and setting up automated test scripts that kick off so that not only do we do our build, but not only do we deploy it, but we run through a whole set of regression tests so that before I do anything else, I have some assurance that this application was deployed and a standard set of tests has executed and passed. And doing that in an automated way versus very manual ways that might be being done today. So look at that and set realistic expectations for the organization. And then last is kind of seek out professional help to do your blueprint. So, and again, obviously, I have a self-interest in this concept of the recipe for success. But it is really true that you need organizations that have done this and worked through this. And most organizations might have pockets of it that they have, and you might have expertise in it. But it's actually developing the overall roadmap and blueprint for your DevOps journey. The other part that really is important is somebody that, again, is not part of those protected interests. So if you bring in a good organization that kind of does what my organization does or other ones that do, you want to be there to kind of speak the truth of what will work for the organization. And if you're beyond those protected interests, you're going to go to the organization and say, if you're providing value to them, this is what you should be looking at, even if that's not popular. So there's times where you may look and say you're going to waste a lot of effort and energy going down this route, or have you looked at this alternative? And it allows you to cut through and provide this kind of professional view from an organization that's done it. So, I mean, the analogy that we'll use is even if you're the best carpenter or plumber or have friends to do this, you probably want to find an architect to at least give you the blueprint. If you're planning on building the cottage yourself, great. There's nothing saying you have to have an army of professionals come in and help you do this if you feel you can do it yourself. But it's probably not a bad idea to have an architect who's done this before give you the blueprint to establish at least the terms of what you're looking to build from a DevOps strategy. So with that, I can turn it back maybe to you, Sam, and see if we have any questions and that I can go through for any of the attendees.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dan. We will indeed open up for questions now. And for anyone that might have missed it in the introduction, if you would like to ask a question, please do so using the chat window located in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. One of the first questions that's come through here, Dan, is what kind of metrics are useful for tracking DevOps?
Well, okay, so I mean, I think like anything, what you want to do is look within your organization to determine what's most important. But some of the ones that we would recommend to teams are the deployment frequency. So it can be kind of a direct or indirect measure of the response time and how cohesive the developer teams are, what the effectiveness of their development tools are, and the overall DevOps team efficiency. So saying that we moved from one deployment every 3 months to one every month, just having that and then doing that at a macro level across the organization to say the increase in frequency of deployments that you're doing is a good one. The failure rate of changes is one, and this may not be popular within organizations, but from DevOps to turn these kind of rapid deployments into this thing, we also want to make sure that the failure rate is low. So the failure rate should be decreasing over time. So if we're doing things in efficiency, we're getting more frequent deployments, but we're seeing less kind of failures or the need for rollbacks. Because the last thing we want to do is be doing frequent deployments, but then having very frequent failure rates. Kind of the last one is this kind of mean time to recovery is one that's called. So this is the time where if you do have a failure, to recover from that. And I mentioned kind of whether it's been airlines or the stock exchanges. We've all seen very highly publicized things where something got moved in to an environment. There was a requirement to roll back. Well, what is the time to recover? How quickly do we identify it? How quickly do we recover from that? And again, if we have good processes that are documented, those should be decreasing over time because we're removing the kind of unfamiliarity with the process by having it well established, so we know exactly what the steps are to move back. We're not guessing to say what went in that might have caused this, we have a good way to roll back to a previous state.
Excellent. Another question, how are operations teams adopting Agile?
I think that the main area that we end up seeing is that operations teams needing to do it, and a lot of times from a very kind of tactical way, and mostly based around tooling. And what we try to come in and do is say, well, tooling is a part of that, but the main thing that you're interested in is governance. So operations teams have the perception, and sometimes they get a bad rap as being that kind of governor of agility that I mentioned, that they're the thing that we want to go 200 miles an hour, but their role within the organization is prevent us from going that fast. Well, not necessarily. And if you work with them to say that you can still have governance, you can still have the requirements for a risk-averse organization to do this, it's really that sort of process transformation that we want to see for teams that are adopting operations. So a lot of times the initial piece is kind of the shiny object of we're bringing in this new technology that will allow us to automate these processes. That's kind of the typical thing we first hear, and maybe that's the first time organizations will contact us, is to say, do we have experience with this specific tool or this specific platform? But once you get on the ground, you really need to start asking, again, those questions about, can we examine the processes that you have and streamline more of it than the tool can be a companion of, but independent of the tool of choice, really.
Okay, great. Any other questions from the audience? Those were the only two that have come through at this point. I'll hang on for maybe a second or a few more, see if anyone else has any last ones to toss up here. Here's one. Any success with hardware and software combined products or recommendation?
So from the question, I'm guessing it's kind of both that you're talking about a combination platform that is both sort of the hardware platform and software. The software that lives on it. So I'm thinking like a mobile device, say, where you've not only got the hardware, but you're combining in the specific of the software. From the scaled Agile perspective, that's all going to be part of the same kind of release train and that cadence. And this is, again, where we're talking about the dependencies that you end up seeing and building that organization. Now, this is, again, where you may have the way that you build those teams may be dependent on that type of platform view, and the way you look at it from a DevOps standpoint may be impacted. So you may have a combined team whose role is more from a architecture and integration perspective to convey that information across the team. So to say that we're making this change to the hardware platform to add, I'll use my iPhone as an example, the ability for you to put the chip to measure your steps in it. Okay, well, from the software perspective, we can now write an application to measure the number of steps I've taken because you've added that hardware component. So what you end up seeing from the SAFe perspective is the requirement for those to be aligned. How the organization then deals with that demonstration to say, okay, I now only have a prototype of this device to demonstrate for you that has this new chip in that does that, but now I'm also going to show you the app and how it measures that, and do that obviously in a way prior to you releasing it to the customer.
Great. And they did verify that the hardware and software combo you were talking about was correct, so good inference there. Any other questions? Yep, the slides will be available later on. We'll send out an email for anyone that missed that in the intro as well. Well, Dan, I think you might have just covered the topic so well. We only had a couple of questions out of that, so well done.
Okay, great.
So, well, Dan, I want to thank you for your time and presentation. Like I said, I think it went really well, and Appreciate it.
Okay.
And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for attending. Please do help us improve our future events and take a few moments to fill out your post-event survey. We'd love to hear your feedback. But this concludes today's conference, so have a fantastic day.